Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Fundamentals and Practical Leadership webinar series for new and emerging leaders. This is session 1, Your Reason to Lead. My name is Maria Sanchez-Keene. I am from the Center for Organizational Effectiveness, and we are glad that you're able to join us today. Just a little bit of orientation with respect to our webinar tool today. You do have a variety of ways in which we can interact. The first thing, if you look at your console, you'll see that there's a place for questions here. So you can actually click on this and then you'll be able to add questions, any questions that you might have. We'll be monitoring those. There is an audio, hopefully you can hear me, and you are all muted just for sound clarity. But if you raise your hand as in on your console, if you click on that little icon that is a hand, we'll be able to see that. And as well, we'll have a lot of interactive polls as we go through this afternoon in terms of the 2 webinars, the first one, and then we'll take a small break and we'll move into the second webinar. So we are the Center for Organizational Effectiveness. We work with nonprofit, charitable, and public organizations. You see our why there on the page: to create greater good for our world by strengthening organizations, communities, and systems to better serve their people. Today with us, we have Carrie Selkirk, who is the Senior Consultant with the Center. She'll be doing Module 2. Kathleen Schwarz is our Communications and Research Associate, and she is monitoring the questions and the chat. So if you have anything and all the technology, so you can certainly draw any attention to that, and she'll be monitoring that. And I think Gerda is also joining us today. So the first webinar is about your why. Why do you want to be a leader or a manager? Why do you want to be in leadership and management? What is it about that fits with your personal values? What's the difference between management and leadership? And we really wanted to spend a significant amount of time on this aspect of your why, so that you can have a deep understanding of how your why connects to your leadership, and so that we have clarity related to that as we think about the tools and the practical ways in which you might be called into leadership and management. So we do want to start with just getting a sense of who is with us today. Oops. So a little bit about you. So you will see on your console this area that's called handouts, and on it you'll see a thing that's called links to polls, and I see that some of you have already found it. And when you click on that, you'll see something that looks like this. If you click anywhere on that, it should take you to a page where you can start filling in the first question here. So recognizing that you may cross sectors, with what sector do you primarily identify? And again, this just gives us an idea of who's with us and gives you a good sense of the people that are participating in it today. So I'll give you a moment to complete that. There's about 96 of us all together. So once you've completed your portion, you've checked off whichever one it is, I'll ask you to minimize that and then get back to the screen where you were for GoToWebinar, and you should be able to see an interactive poll that's telling us where people are coming from. So again, we'll just give a sec for that. So we see as it's being completed that we have good representation from across many sectors: children's mental health and addictions, employment training and small business support as well, primary care, community support services is with us, justice, so many different sectors. Okay, so you may want to go back to that handout, that page for the next poll. So it will be part of your browser at this point. And so the next question is this, similar to how we started the last webinar on leadership in the time of COVID-19. How long have you been in any form of leadership position? So I'm not yet, but I aspire to be 1 year or less, 1 to 3 years, 4 to 10, longer than I have fingers to count on. Good, so that's coming quick. Just give it a moment. Excellent. Okay, so we see here that we have many aspiring leaders, so welcome to you. We have a good section of those who've been in leadership for 1 year or less, 1 to 3, 4 to 10, and those who have been here in leadership for many years, and welcome to them as well. A reminder that this is for new and emerging leaders, and hopefully affirming to you as a leader if you've been in leadership for a while. All right, so the last question as we start this part of our webinar is this. When did you know that you wanted to be a leader? So a bit harder. So for some of us, it was like, yeah, when I was 4, I knew I was going to be a leader. For some, it might be when someone called it out in me. For some, it might be, you know what, I just kind of grew into the position. So this one, you just kind of answer in text format, and then we'll see how answers come up. So since I was a kid, when you were ready for something new, early in my career. I've always wanted to be a leader. In high school. In the last 5 years. Always wanted to be. From a young age. I grew into the position. Yeah, it comes so differently for so many of us. When I was young in sports. Yeah, it happened organically. You kind of grew into it. Within the first year of my direct care work experience. It happened over time. Since high school. Logical next steps. Yeah, so interesting. As we think about our why, when we think about, when did I know, or when did I have a sense that this was something that I really wanted to do and really nurture? And again, it comes at it from a variety of perspectives, as you see coming up on the screen. I was being gently encouraged by other leaders soon after my career started. All right, well, thank you. That's helpful just to get a sense of where we're at as a group. So I'm going to move that off the screen and we'll come back to it in a little bit. All right, so the why question. So some of you, there we go. Some of you might be familiar with Simon Sinek's work, Start with the Why. And it's not a new concept in that for many people who've been around leadership for a long time, it may have been described as your mission statement or your core purpose statement, but it really continues to come up in leadership theory and leadership books around this idea that it's really valuable for us to have a deep understanding of why we do what we do. And our leadership stems from that. So it's connected to what we believe is significant about us and what it is that we want to do in the world, and then how leadership flows from that perspective. So we're going to talk a little bit about this today, and we're going to dedicate a big portion of this webinar today. Partly because when we were putting the webinar series together and when we were speaking to executive directors, it came up quite a bit. It came up as something really important. What we hear from leaders is, from executive directors is, we really think we need to spend time nurturing leadership within our organizations, but we're stretched. We may not have internal resources to develop the tools or to develop the actual series, but we know it's important. Innately, we know it's important. And as we went through that with them, they spoke more and more about the importance of understanding your why and then connecting it to leadership. So what I want to do with you today is actually share a little bit about my why statement and how that has really informed me as a person and as a leader. And so it was actually when I was 24 years old, and it was a course that I was taking. And I was kind of in the same situation as the aspiring leaders in our group are today, where I was learning a lot about it. And one of the exercises was to develop my mission statement. Now, over the years, it has evolved. At 24, I didn't have children, for example. But it is something I didn't know at 24 how foundational this statement would become for me as a person in my career and as a leader. I feel a little bit vulnerable sharing it with you because mission statements are quite personal. But of course, we thought we needed to lead by example. So here it is. My why. Knowing we belong to an everlasting story of love. So in essence, that's like my fundamental why, is that I believe in goodness. I believe in a world filled with love and a world that we have to create toward love. So knowing we belong to an everlasting story of love, may my life be an expression of this as I make relationships the focal point of my life. May these relationships be built on love, passion, intimacy, honesty, integrity, laughter, and joy, qualities I desire for myself. May these qualities be truest in my marriage, with my most intimate companion, with my family and friends. May I be a mother whose actions, words, intentions, and desires lead my children to realize that they are part of this everlasting story of love. May my life be an expression of this as I work with others to co-create a world of justice, peace, and love, using all my gifts for the service of others, especially the least in our world. May I lead from a place of servant leadership, celebrating when others say, we did it ourselves. May I take time to exercise, rest, relax, celebrate, and nurture myself. And may our home be a place of welcome and hospitality, where others are reminded that they too belong to this everlasting story of love. So as I was preparing this for the webinar, I happened to run it by my husband, Dan, and my daughter, Monica. And they have a way, it's good that you do this and run these by your family members, because they can kind of put you back in your place. And so my husband said, well, you know, it's your mission statement, so you're working towards it, so that's good. And my daughter said, well, I like how it says may and not will, as in I know that this statement, while true and aspirational, isn't necessarily the way I live my life every day, but it's certainly something that anchors me and helps me to be reminded of what it is that I want to be in the world. It tells me my why. And so as we go through today, I want you to start thinking about, what is my why? What is it that I want to think about? And perhaps you have a personal why statement already. And so this will be more about refreshing it and looking at it again and determining whether it continues to tell you about your why. So I want to ask you just a few questions in terms of what you think about this idea. So we're going to go back to the polls. So as a reminder, you go back to your browser where we opened up the questions, just a few questions so that I get a sense of what you think about all this. So the first one is, do you have a written why, core mission, core purpose or mission statement? So no, yes, or I'm in the process of creating one, just so that I have an understanding. Okay. Okay. So a stretch for many of you is to really start thinking about, should I create one? What would be the benefit and value? And that's part of what I want to talk about today, is really, so you write one and then what? So next question. Thanks for that. Next question is this. There's two more questions in this section. So how would you see this as valuable for you? And you might say, I don't, but how would you if you do? Helps me keep focused, anchors me. Writing anything down holds accountability and helps gain clarity. It would guide my daily interactions. Yes, it is my guiding star. Helps through the tough days. Keep me focused, accountable. Yeah, that's such an important one. Keeps me focused on what's important, particularly in our lives that are filled with urgency. Yes, good place to reflect, center myself. Yes, accountability. Stay on track. Focus. Yeah, good. I'm not certain. Yeah, what would be the value of this? We'll talk a little bit more about it to see if it helps. With goals, ways to keep you feel grounded. Yeah, provides a guide for aspiring leader. Anchor to bring me back to my purpose. Keep me focused on my goals. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I'll move that out of the way. Oh no, one more question, sorry. Next one. What 3 words do you think you might include in your why, core purpose, or mission statement? So if you think about it, it's like, if I don't have one, or if you do, what words are already there? Empathy. Support, encourage, inspire, balance, give, growth. And sure, yeah, it takes time to do this work, and I'll talk a little bit about that, the importance, if you're interested in doing this, how it does take time. And so being put on the spot like this is not good for some. Spiritual people, self-care, integrity, inspire, leadership, compassion, inspirations, growth, support, selfless, community good, impactful, mentor, awesome words, servant, kindness, inspire, empower, authentic, fun, transformative. So many good words. Thank you. Yeah, so that's the start, when you start thinking, yeah, what am I about? What is my why? And beginning to articulate it, even in the words that we're hearing now. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to move that off to the side and continue with the presentation. So this is a really kind of nice, as I was saying, inspirational statement that you can write while you're by the water and all those good things. And if we think about the canvas of our life, it kind of looks more like this, right? This is my reality, and I know the reality of so many people that we work with. It is about all of the home stuff, right? The laundry and all the forms that have to get filled in, and the school buses and the tears, even as they get into teenage years. And then, of course, there's the work and the processes for us and the people and the presentations. And there's just so much happening that sometimes, as you mentioned in your responses, what a why statement does for us is that it anchors us. It cuts through this. It reminds me. It helps me to say, okay, as I go through this day-to-day rut, which it sometimes feels like, what is it that holds me? What is it that holds me together? As I think about leadership and my leadership when I work with organizations, what is it that I want to model? How do I want to do the work? What are the values that I bring to the work that I want to ensure that are resonating with the organizations that I work with, but also have a sense of deep purpose that connects with my why. So I just wanted to, give you a sense that while on paper it looks kind of this antiseptic and this formal and this real, this is where it happens. And this is probably what Dan and Monica were trying to tell me. It's like, yeah, that's all nice and good, Mom, but in the everyday, how do we live it out? In the everyday of leadership, in the everyday of our work, how can we lead through these pieces that we're talking about? So that's the context of trying to anchor everyday living and everyday leadership with a statement that helps us to put it all into perspective. And so I want to talk a little bit about how you create a why statement, because again, we think it is so essential. And I know many of the executive directors we talked about said it was pretty important to help people understand their why. So I want to say that there is no need to wait until you are in formal leadership. So for most of you who are aspiring leaders, this is a great time to do it. What is your why in terms of leadership? What is it that you would bring and what you want to be about? And I also want to say it's never late to write one, never too late to write one. So that if you don't have one and you've been a leader for a while, this might be an interesting exercise for you to do as well. Want to emphasize that leadership springs from your core identity. So I don't believe so much in having your why statement for you and then having a leadership why statement. I do think that they intermingle and connect deeply together. And so what I'd encourage you to do is to have an element of leadership within your why statement. And again, if you have one already, it might be looking at it again and saying, what did I say about leadership that I might want to add about how I want to be a leader in the world? And it really articulates in many ways why you want to get up in the morning. And so as we think about this reality and really challenging times, and I know that we've all had them, it really does. My why anchors me and helps me to figure out why it is that I want to get up in the morning. And mostly I think about the people that I know that are getting up that have the same purpose as I to make a better world as they get up every day, even through tough times. So really important points for us to keep in mind as we think about why we'd want to create one and when we can create one. And so I want to share a little bit about the process. Again, this is one process. We have many of them for you to think about at the bottom of the slides that you'll be receiving. Excuse me. You'll see a variety of resources, and they're all ways in which you can write a mission statement. So I'm going to share one. And it is one that I used, and it's also one, as I've taught on this, that I've presented and have received some really beautiful mission statements back that in terms of marking and so forth. So one way to do it. I want to say that it takes time. So this is hard if you want to do it authentically and for it to be meaningful to you to kind of cram at the last second. You can do it and you can hand it in and it's not a big deal. But if you want it to be meaningful for you, it does take time. I want to share how, when I was 24, how that happened for me. So I was taking a course and I was asked to do this why statement. And I, at that time, thought that it would be really valuable for my partner to do it as well, for Dan to do it. And now you have to understand, Dan is a Irish Canadian, happy-go-lucky, football, beer drinking kind of guy. So writing a mission statement and me saying, hey, let's write our mission statement wasn't necessarily in his idea of fun. However, he took me up on it because I offered that we go to a beach, that we bring great food and some beverages, and that we, sit kind of apart in a quiet place of the beach and really have, deep dialogue about what's important to each of us. And it turned out to be a really amazing day for us. And it was a day. It took us a day to really sit and, obviously it wasn't like we talked like about it all the time, but we created the space in which we could really think about our why and what we wanted to do. And as I mentioned to you, I didn't anticipate that it would have the effect that it did for the rest of my life. That statement that you saw, it didn't look quite like that as we started, but it certainly has been important to me. And I'll share ways in which we continue to weave it into our everyday life as we go forward. So a process. Invite you to first start by considering and writing all of your roles. And so think holistically about every role that you play in this world. And that is just a helpful list to think about, okay, what might I write about this in terms of my why and how I want to be in the world? And then you might want to create another list, which is your values. So you can brainstorm those and then maybe select top 3 to 5 values that you think these are my non-negotiables. No matter where I work, no matter how I'm involved in leadership, these are non-negotiables for me and I want to lead from them. I want to be in an organization that espouses to them and I want to be about them in every part of my life. So you create your roles and you think about your values and then you breathe, relax, and imagine in some quiet time. So this is where we closed our eyes on the beach and laid back. And you imagine that you are celebrating your 80th birthday party. And so this is like a guided meditation. So at your 80th birthday party, you imagine an amazing celebration where people from all your walks of life are there. Imagine the party in as much detail as you can. So who is there, the setting, the decorations, the food, the music. So if you've done guided meditations, you know that the more you go into the detail, the more profound the experience can be. And then when you're ready, you imagine individuals from your life standing there and one by one sharing who you are and how you've impacted their life, perhaps how you've impacted the community, the world. And imagine you have fulfilled your roles and your leadership roles to your fullest potential. So you go and you say, yeah, I did it. And what are people saying now? And as you come out of your guided meditation, you then look at your roles and you think about the tribute words that you heard, about the difference that you made. And that now becomes the makings of a mission statement. So you have your values, you have your roles, you have words that you hope people will say as you celebrate your 80th birthday to then begin to write a mission statement. Your why statement or your mission statement, there's really no right or wrong to this. I've seen some that are really pithy and amazing, as well as really lengthy ones that are amazing, some that are done by roles, some that are done by values, as long as it speaks to you and it brings you back to your center and it ignites a passion for living and for leadership, you've done it right. And so again, there's other examples of how you might do this. Yeah, I encourage you to take time. You may have time during these times to do it, you may not, but take time to reflect if you really want to enter into this really important part of leadership that sometimes we forget about, but that anchors the work that we do. So then you might say, okay, great, I write it. And what we don't want to do, like we don't want to do with strategic plans, is have them somewhere where you dust it off, I don't know, every year or every 5 years, and you say, yeah, what was it that I wrote? How is this important to me? So what I want to do is share an example of how it's become a living document for me. And again, this might not work for you. It certainly is not the way that Dan does it. He's got his own process for it because we're such different people. But I'll share this one in the hope that it might give you some ideas of how you make this a living document for yourself. So I have this quadrant that I use. I've had it for years and years. In the first part, you'll see here, it talks about my why or my mission statement, which is what I just read. And then once a year, so January 1 is a pretty sacred date for me. This is what I do every year. I reflect on the year past, and then I look at the year ahead, and I think about this year. So you'll see in the what I have for this year. 2020 is a year of vision and hope. Well, that was easy because it's 2020, so vision was easy. And hope. We've had some hard years as a family, so this was an important year for us. And so we think about the years of celebration. That was what we talked about. So we have my daughter's wedding, another daughter who is graduating, my son who's also graduating, and we're celebrating 20 years for CfOE. So you can imagine how this is going now during these times, but we're trying to figure that all out. But it was a year of celebration. And then because it was 2020, I wrote a little statement about the decade where I really wanted to focus on revitalizing the earth, community, and the human spirit. And then I talked about, okay, well, what gifts do I bring? This is the stuff I do every year. So this year I wrote experience, wisdom, hope, and presence. Then I wrote what I need. And what I need is to move away from just a to-do list, which you might be laughing at, given that this looks like a to-do list. But I know that that is my Achilles heel. I know that I can just get driven and just think about checking boxes. And so you'll note that in my mission statement, it is almost the reverse of those pieces that are there. So you move towards presence, celebration, joy, and then I want to hold center. And I mean 2020 be wonderful and celebratory and meaningful and healing. And then I write my yearly goals about how I'm going to stay fit physically, spiritually, and mentally, focus on relationships, celebrate, reach out, and balance. So I've got statements underneath those as well. And then on an ongoing basis, sometimes weekly, it doesn't always happen, trust me, but as regularly as I can, I think about, well, what went well this week? What didn't go as well? What are the priorities for this week? And what are some ways that I can continue to focus on my goals and tackle the priorities ahead? What I find is that weekly planning allows me to look at a chunk of time that is doable. And it allows me to be a bit more intentional about what it is that I want to focus on. And sometimes it's about, I really want to call a certain client that I know is struggling, a person. I really want to develop and read this article that I didn't read yet. I want to spend time with one of my children who I know is struggling a little bit. Whatever it might be, a week at a time allows me to put those things in. And I don't always get to them. In fact, I often don't, but at least I'm attempting to. So this is my attempt at trying to weave my why and have it become very much a part of my everyday life. So then you might ask, how do we begin to translate that into the work that we're talking about in terms of leadership? So what you could do, and what I've done in the past, is you take similar quadrants to look at them from the lens of your team. And again, for you as aspiring leaders, you might be leading a project, or you might be thinking about a time in which you were leading, or a way in which you hope you were to lead, or can lead. So what you would do is, using the same thing as you would type, you would write out your team's why or core purpose. So always it has to be aligned to the vision and the mission of the organization. But it doesn't mean that you can't take your team and say, okay, so how does our little picture of our team fit into the bigger picture of our organization? And this process of writing your team's why might be very helpful. So it might look really different for the administrative team at Addiction Services Thames Valley, and it might look really different at the law team at a child welfare agency, or the intake team at children's mental health sector. So you can take the vision and mission of your organization and then lead your team through a process of, what is our deep why? How do we do this work and do it well? And it can be a really reigniting work to do with your team. And then you might once a year think about leading your team through this reflection questions that I have there. So 2020, what is it that we want for 2020? Never too late to do it. What are the gifts, strengths, and skills that we bring into 2020? What needs do we have? So as we look back at the year past, were we really struggling with anything? Was it conflict? Was it attendance? Was it motivation? Was it that we're burnt out? What needs do we have that we want to really take care of and tend to in this upcoming year? And what hope do we have from our team and how it connects to the rest of the organization and the rest of the system? So some reflection questions, and then align to your organization's mission and strategic plan. What are your goals? And we know that some of them are given to you, right? You have certain targets that you have to meet. The strategic plan will certainly be informing that, but you may also within that have some other elements that you want to add to your team's work. And then we call, instead of ongoing reflection, we might call this continuous improvement. And there we want to talk about what went well, what didn't go so well, what are the priorities for next week, and what are some ways we can continue. And you might say, yeah, we're going to do that on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis. This is an example for you to use and think about, how do I, as a leader, weave a why into the work that I do for my team to stay connected and to remember our core purpose in the work that we do. So just an example of how we do that. All right. So I just want to get, I know I talked for a long time. What I want to do is just get a sense from you. Again, if we go back to our, the polls, the questions, do you have any comments, thoughts, or questions? And we'll just pause there so that I get a sense of where you're at. I'll answer this. Oh, how about I activate the poll? Hopefully it's working. There we go. Yes, you will receive, thank you. The chart, we can share it with you both in Word as well as within the PowerPoint. A lot to think about. Solid framework, yeah. Yeah, it is a lot to think about. I think that is really valid to just pause and think about, why do I do it, and can I write that? Oh, that's such an interesting question. I wonder how different my mission statement might be now versus creating it before the pandemic that we are in now. So valid. And I'm telling you that it's amazing how going through mine year over year, how some things just stay true no matter what. And then as my life has grown and I've grown as a person, how other elements have changed. Yeah, the framework can anchor a team and bring it together. Absolutely. For me, it's a tension between the intent and action. I have a lot of intent to do this work. Being able to have the authentic space to do it is very difficult. Oh my goodness, I hear you. I hear you. I'll share a few tips on that. One is I find Sunday evening a really good time to kind of pull my week together and then try to plan for the week ahead. In my busiest moments, I don't do that at all. I wish I could, but I know that when I anchor on Sunday evening, it tends to help me a bit, if that's helpful. Something I haven't considered before. Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll continue as we move forward with the presentation. So for those of you, there is a ability to get a certificate out of this webinar series. For those of you who are in that stream, if you're thinking, I don't know if I'm on that stream, speak to your lead in the organization, in your organization. If you're thinking, I want to be, that's not a problem. We can make that happen as well. So in essence, for this webinar, what you would need to do is actually develop your why statement or refresh it if you already have one, and then reflect on how it aligns with the why or the mission of your organization. So we want you to be able to say, here is who I am and my why, and then how it connects to the why of your organization. Sometimes it does, and sometimes there's pieces that don't, but at least being able to share and reflect on that. And then share what the process of creating or refreshing your why statement was like for you. So we're looking at a max of 3 pages for this part of the certificate. And I just wanted to share that with you as we close off this section of this session. Okay, so what I want to do for the last part of this webinar now is to really start thinking about the rest of the sessions. So here we're talking about the why, and for the rest of the sessions, we're going to start talking about the really practical tools for new and emerging leaders related to both leadership and management. So the first thing we want to do is just think about what is the difference between leadership and management. So it's really important for us to think about that it is not about managers here, it's about management and about leadership in being a leader or a team lead or a coordinator, director, manager, whatever your title might be, or not. And you still need to develop these for your work and then as you are aspiring leaders. It's important for you to know that both are really important, leadership and management. And often we tend to talk more about leadership, but management is as essential to be a good leader. Both are really significant parts. And you'll notice as I go through some of these definitions that you may have a more natural tendency toward one than the other. And so that might tell you where it is that you need to spend some time in terms of professional development, because we tend to go with our professional development towards the things that we love, which is amazing. But we also, as leaders, need to be thinking about what are the areas that I need to be really developing as I move forward. So what I want to do, again, just back to our polls, is think about, oh, and I think I lost it there for a minute. Think about, so I just have to, here we go, this question here. So what do you see as the difference between management and leadership? Give you a moment. Leaders are more inspirational. Yeah, leadership is something I can do without being in a formal leadership position. Leadership inspires. Yes, management is tactical, leadership is strategic. Good definition. Leadership strategic long-term, leading through example, setting company culture. More aspirational, manageable, more tactical. Inspiring versus doing. Yes, good point. I don't believe you have to be in a manager role to be a good leader. Absolutely. Management is about accomplishing goals and tasks. Management is a title, leadership is a role, a way of living. Beautiful. Official job title. Anyone can be a leader. Okay, interesting. Interesting. Okay, so what we want to talk a little bit about today is that, in fact, to be a leader, you need both skill sets, a managing skill set and a leading skill set in order to be really effective. Management, dealing with problems, leadership, coaching, mentoring, guiding. Leaders coach. Leadership is an approach, management is day-to-day tasks, absolutely. Showing versus telling. What's really interesting is, and I don't have a poll for this, but really interesting would be how many of you in leadership have to do both, because it's so easy if all we needed to do was inspire, although that's very hard work to do as well. But so many of us have to do the other aspect of managing as we go through. Mentoring, guiding, organizing work. Yeah, you've got it. So let me just share some definitions, but you've got some really good sense of it already. I'm gonna move that over. Here we go. So just step by step here. So leadership fosters the vision, management requires tenacity. So the questions, no matter whether you're a formal leader or not, the questions as you enter work is, how do I foster and get my team excited about the vision of where we are going? And how do I continually work toward meeting the goals set before us? So sometimes when we are in a position that isn't the top leader position or executive director, board, or senior leaders, we think, well, they're left to do all of the leadership, I just have to manage. And I go into my team just thinking, okay, here's what I have to do. But what I'm here to say, and what I think the series will show us, is that in fact, you also have to be the one that fosters the vision as well as the tenacity piece. So in fact, sometimes in that middle management role, you have to develop both, because both are required as you take the lead from your key leaders. So leadership inspires change, management manages the transformation. So important here. How can I inspire my team toward the changes required? And in this time, that would be the case. How do you continue to inspire, especially as we're chugging along now in this reality? And then how do I develop a plan to transform my team toward the change? So when something foundational is happening in terms of a change within your organization, if you are a leader in a leadership role or an informal leader, you need to also be thinking about, how do I continue to inspire the change with my team, and how do I manage that transformation? Leadership uses imagination, management requires specific, really true. So we need to have a really bold vision of where we're going, our why as we fit into that. And then I also need to get down to the specifics, that Excel spreadsheet that tells me exactly what it is that needs to occur in order to get where I need to go. Leadership needs to think broadly and systematically. Management requires concrete data. So both the skills are, how do I think about our work as a team, or my work within the system of my organization? And for many of us in the work that you're doing with people with great complexity, you're no longer seeing someone that only is in your organization. You're talking about the system of all your partners and all the policy that comes down and all the changes that we're seeing in so many of the different sectors. So you need to have a deep sense of that, and at the same time then be able to say, okay, but what's my concrete data that tells me whether or not we're moving in the direction that we need to move in? And a final one, and there's many of these, but these are kind of the top ones that came to us. Leadership requires the ability to engage, and management requires the ability to accomplish. And sometimes it's hard to do both. And so in your teams, you may be able to say, okay, I know that there are some people that in my team that are better at engaging, or that are better at accomplishing. And that's the beauty of a team, is that you can use the skill set of everybody. I know also that in a team, there could be individuals who are really leaning towards needing a lot of engagement, and some who will be leaning a lot towards accomplishment. And it is about trying to carry that tension between those. So when is it that we really need to be about engagement, and when is it that we really need to be about accomplishment? How do we balance that? As a leader, it is your job to think about, when do I need to be fostering the vision? When do I need to be thinking about tenacity? How do I inspire change at the same time as manage and accomplish the transformation? How do I nurture imagination and also have the specifics at the same time? How do I think about the system and think broadly, and then also have really concrete data with respect to this? How is it that I keep my team engaged and at the same time make sure that I'm meeting the targets and the deliverables? Sometimes, depending on the person that you are, you will lean more one way than the other. And part of good leadership is being able to read, when does my team need what? How do I shift my leadership to understand what they need and deliver on what it is that they need in order to be able to continue, both from the perspective of relationship as well as the perspective of delivering on the product as we go forward. So good. So some definitions, and again, we'll be going through a lot of this as we go through the conversations in the next sessions as we go forward. So what I want to do before we finish, what we'd like to do is take a 10-minute break. So I want to finish my session by 12:50, so that we have a 10-minute break so you can go and stretch, go to the bathroom, grab something, and then come back right for 1 o'clock when Carrie will start her session. So what I want to do is just introduce that topic to you. So session 2 is about what changes for you when you become a leader. This is actually a really important point here, because many of you are in that space of aspiring leadership or really early in your leadership. And that's what this whole series is about. And it's really important for you to have an understanding that things do change when you move into leadership. And for those of you who've been in leadership for years, you probably can speak very specifically to the time when you really notice that change. So I wanted to share a little bit about my experience early on in my career when that happened to me in a very significant way. And so I was 25 years old, and I was a part of a team that but felt a lot like the team that you're seeing on your screen right now. We all were, we worked well together. We huddled well. We did our team effectively. We had an amazing leader, and that leader suddenly left. And at that point, I was doing my thing. I was loving what I was doing and growing as a team player. And the leadership position came up, and I was tapped on the shoulder to apply for it. And at that time, I just thought, okay, well, I'm going to apply, but I'm not going to get it. I just had a real clear sense that this wasn't going to be my job. There was someone else on our team that I thought was going to get it, but I went for it. And I ended up getting it. And so I really didn't have much preparation on the shift that happened as I took on that leadership position. And Carrie's going to really dive into some of these important pieces for you to be aware of as you're a new leader or even changing in a leadership position within an organization. And so some of the things that I experienced that I was not prepared for was, first of all, a change in my relationship with my teammates. I just assumed that everything would continue the way that it always was. Like, I was friends with these people. I got along with them really well. And the second I became a leader to them, our relationship changed. And they saw me as the person that they were accountable to. And I wasn't prepared for that change at all. So being prepared for some of those shifts that happen with respect to relationships. The person that thought that he was going to get the role was probably twice my age. And I now had to manage and lead him. And he was pretty bent out of shape about the fact that he didn't get the role, and made my life very, very difficult. Eventually, I had to let him go. And so I wasn't prepared for anyone being insubordinate, not listening to me, challenging my leadership, pushing my boundaries, and then the experience of actually having to determine that this was someone that I needed to let go. So these are things that happen as we move into either your first leadership or a change in leadership, that the more that you're aware of them and the more that you think about the skills that you need to manage these, the better off that you are. So I know that you will really enjoy the next part of the series with Carrie as we think about what changes for you when you become a leader, the expectations that your organization has, the expectations that you need to have on yourself, and the expectations that you will have for your team and that the team will have for you. So thank you. It is now 12:50. So we are going to take a 10-minute break. Now, what I ask you to do is don't touch your webinar equipment at all, because we'll be able to just continue from here, but certainly step away. We're going to take a pause and just put up a screen, and we'll start right back up at 1 o'clock. Thanks very much, everybody.
And thank you very much, Maria, for sharing your very personal mission statement and your process to developing your mission statement. Very much something else that leaders do is dig deep like that and make yourself vulnerable to share with folks and to connect and to empower folks to do things for themselves. So that is very much appreciated and something that we can all learn from, absolutely. We're going to spend the next hour talking about what changes for you as a leader and recognizing that we have with us, again, both people who aspire to leadership and management roles and people who spent significant time in leadership and management roles. Hopefully, this is an opportunity for those of you who've spent times in those roles to reflect on your own journey and to think about how you share your journey and connect with your new leaders to support them as they're navigating these changes. So the next slide has for us our agenda. The next slide actually has for us, sorry, Maria, if you can, thank you. Our agenda for the day, the change that is coming just ahead for you if you're aspiring to be a leader. And apologies, Maria, if you want to go back up to the first picture. Thank you. So I did want to actually spend just a quick moment before we got to the agenda talking about the why as well and the difference between leadership and management and share with you today some images. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to spend 6 weeks in Whistler last summer, and this particular image is at the pinnacle of a 10-kilometer hike on Whistler Mountain. It's an overlook to Chickamus Lake, and it's a trail that one would call intermediate. It has a bit of scrabbling and quite a rocky trail. And the person who was leading and guiding us through this process, here's the why we went through this hike, how she managed to convince a bunch of beginner hikers that this was something that was worth doing, something that we could do, is spend our day on this hike to see this beautiful view that you can't see otherwise. And then the next picture talks a little bit about how she operated as a manager in this particular process. So you can see again that it's not necessarily a beginner hike by any stretch. You can see the lake there in the background. And so as a leader, she talked to us about the vision, the beautiful day, the scenery, the accomplishment of it all. And then as a manager, she made sure we all got there safely. This is a part of the mountain that if you sprain an ankle, you've got to get yourself a certain amount of the way before somebody can come and rescue you. So the process was managed by talking to us about staying 6 feet apart so that if you start to fall, you don't grab a hold of somebody else and cause 2 injuries. It was about checking our backpacks and making sure that we had the water and the nourishment and the cover that we might need in the changeable mountainside. So then, thank you, Maria. We'll get to the agenda next and talk about, as you move into that leadership and management role, the changes that will occur for you, how you see yourself, and all of these other things here. And we're going to start briefly with a poll to this section. And that poll is really to ask you, if you're an aspiring leader, what do you think is the biggest change that will come for you when you move into a manager leader position? If you've been in a manager leader position, that opportunity to reflect on the changes, as Maria did at the end of her last session, reflect on the changes that occurred for you. And we'll give folks a few minutes to provide some answers. So handling relationships with coworkers, absolutely. particularly when you move into a manager leader role, as Maria did, of a team that you have been a colleague of in the past. So that's a significant thing to think about. The dynamics within the organization, absolutely. So the way you think about your work in the organization will change and become a bit bigger picture, potentially, as you move. Communication with all levels. So again, you're communicating from a different place, and you will be communicating likely different things. Letting go of ego, interesting, and thank you. Keeping personal separate from work, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. Knowing your blind spots. Lots about relationships with coworkers and how those things will change. More waiting to guide and not direct. So again, that's the leadership versus management, when to step in. That's a great one. We'll talk about that as well. Yeah. Relying on your own thoughts to guide you, having to become a decision maker. Absolutely. Quite often people wish they could make the decision until they are actually in the position of having to make the decision. So that's something really to think about. Absolutely. Learning to be kinder to yourself, and that we're not superheroes, for sure, for sure. Developing confidence, more autonomous decision making. Yeah, those are all absolutely things to think about. Walking in the shadow of the previous beloved leader. We'll talk a bit about legacies and what you need to think about in that respect. Yeah. Trust others to do the day-to-day management of the things that you used to do. That's a significant change for sure. Thank you. Yes. So thank you for those thoughts. We'll move into the next slide of the content. And so setting the context here, and again, you'll see the theme. This was also part of my journey in Whistler. So for the first time ever, I bungee jumped, and it was something like, in some respects, the leap into a management position when you've never done it before. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of the fear of the changes and what supports you have in place to do it. So, you know, it was the process involved the triple checking of the harness that I was wearing, the people who were on the bridge talking me through it and being very supportive as I did it. And the little graph that you see there, there's a circle that was actually from my heart rate monitor, which I intended to take off when I took the jump so that it didn't fly into the river, but I did in the moment forget to take it off. And the two peaks that I have circled there were really interesting to me and something that I've really reflected on since then. The first peak, which you can see my blood pressure goes higher, my heart rate goes higher. That's actually the point in time where I stepped up to the edge and decided that I wasn't going to do it, and actually walked away from the edge and said, no, this isn't for me. And the kind people there said, well, would you like to keep the harness on and think about it for a few more minutes before you decide for sure? I said, absolutely. And a couple minutes later, I walked up to the edge, and as you can see, I made the jump. And the really interesting thing for me about that is the moment that I made the jump, my heart rate did not go near as high as it did in that moment where I walked away from the edge. So, you know, sometimes you have to make the jump. Sometimes the anticipation is worse than the actual jump. And I've heard that from leaders, sort of things that they've put off because they didn't really want to do it. It was going to be very uncomfortable. And when they finally, you know, picked up the phone and made that phone call, had that conversation, it wasn't near as bad as they thought it was going to be. But also reflecting that there's a flip side to that, which we talked about. Maria shared with us in the COVID webinar, the idea of shake, rattle, and roll after the fact. Sometimes the anxiety comes before, sometimes the anxiety comes after, and remembering that you can do it in that moment, that you can approach it with calm and do what you need to do when you're taking that leap into something that feels a bit unknown. So moving into the next part. So we have this change that occurs in professional identity. And it's something that we don't always think about when we're thinking of moving into management and leadership. And the image here is the guide that I had for my 6 weeks in Whistler, who had previously been a championship skier and came to the end of that career and realized that she needed to think about what a new career would look like. And her new career is a hiking guide, a professional executive coach, a fitness instructor, and very similarly to when you move from a frontline position into a management leadership position, you can think about as a professional skier, so much of her success was her own success. She had people who supported her in that success, but it was what she did when she was on the hill that really defined her. And she had to move into this role where what other people do, how she supports other people's success is what defines her. And on the next screen, that's what you will see related to one of the biggest changes in moving into management and leadership, is that what made you successful before, your technical skill, your technical expertise, is no longer what makes you successful as a leader and a manager. Again, your professional identity, even thinking about, when you go and meet new people, you might currently say, well, I'm an employment counselor, I'm a social worker. And that shifts. That's a different conversation now when you introduce yourself and who you are and what you do. And you may still be a social worker, but you and have that designation and have that registration, but what you do in your work every day changes, and it becomes something that you need to be able to articulate and recognize that there's a bit of a loss there if you've really identified with your previous role. You do continue to be part of the team, but different, which a number of people indicated when they were talking about when we did the poll on what changes for you. There is a significant change in your role in the team, and how you spend and focus your time and energy changes. And we're going to dig into that one a little bit further right now. So there's just a bit of a chart here with some of the areas for you to reflect and think on what might be changing, and how you can think about how you're going to do things differently in a new role. Certainly, there's more meetings when you're in a leadership and management role, but it's also the flavor of your participation in those meetings that's going to change probably fairly significantly most of the time. So you may be leading meetings now. When you're sitting in a meeting, your thoughts may be less on putting your own input into a discussion, putting your technical expertise into the discussion, and a broader focus on accomplishing the goals of the meetings, facilitating other people's input. The reason you have other people there in the meeting with you is to hear what they have to say about things, bringing their ideas together, pulling threads together. And the reality is, as a leader and manager, you often have more takeaway work from a meeting. So you have more active engagement than possibly you have in the past. And that also reflects in how you're going to spend time after the meeting. Communication, something else that people reflected on. You're communicating a bit more systemically as opposed to individually. You need to think about confidentiality in new ways, which can be, most of the people that we have on this webinar, confidentiality is part of what they currently do. In a very significant way, part of your professional practice. But as a leader and manager, there are different things that you need to think about that need to be held in confidentiality, and that need to be the way that you articulate things as far as confidentiality. It can also be challenging from the perspective of, we all would strive and want to be very transparent as leaders. And sometimes there's a tension there between things that you must keep confidential and being very transparent. So thinking back into some of the conversations that you've had with leaders and managers where you know that they've been struggling to be as transparent as possible, but trying to maintain confidentiality about human resources, about decisions that have been made. It's something to reflect on how you will think about navigating that. Your area of expertise. You will still have a significant technical expertise from the area that you come from. However, when you're sharing your expertise, it's less about sharing that individual technical expertise, and it is about getting those broader factors, getting information from other people, and sharing a broader opinion or a broader perspective. Knowing how to find the folks who have technical expertise that's necessary that you might not have. So again, you bring your individual expertise to the table, but as you're making broader decisions, you want to make sure that you get the perspectives of other individuals who have other expertises. And some of you, again, may be starting out with a project as a leader. That may be your first opportunity to manage a project. So again, your area of expertise may be the project, but again, in the context of the bigger picture. Your priorities change. In many cases, you spend less time on your daily tasks and more time coordinating longer term projects. So this is where, Maria was talking about to-do lists and calendars. And yes, we certainly don't want to be completely bound by those things, but you also want to think about how you're going to use them differently. You will need more time for working on longer term projects. So you might want to, when you are booking a meeting, for example, block some additional time after the meeting to make sure that you have time to do the things that you need to do that came out of the meeting. Look at the timelines for a project, the end goal, and work your way backwards. Make sure that you've got time blocked. And it might just take you longer to do things because you're spending time coaching others. So giving yourself room in your calendar to do that. We certainly spent a great bit of time talking about certainty in the COVID-19, so I won't spend too much more time on that when we did our previous webinar. And again, always remembering that your ability to accomplish things relies more on other people than it previously did. There's always a certain amount of teamwork. There's always a certain amount of everybody having to do their piece. As a manager and leader, the vast majority of what you accomplish is really other people's accomplishments. So making sure you're thinking about how you are going to structure your time in order to do that. And we'll move on to the next slide. So there's also a change which many of you reflected on in how others see you. And this picture really reflects that our leader in this hike that we were on, she's certainly celebrating with us, but she's not even in the picture because she's the one taking the picture. And I think that just sort of nicely captures the way that things are a bit different when you're a leader and a manager. You will celebrate with your team, but you need to think how you're supporting them and celebrating, how you're making sure that they have that opportunity to celebrate. So we'll move to the next slide. A few people mentioned the legacy of a predecessor, and that can be for better or for worse. Whatever that legacy is, I think somebody mentioned sort of a long-term beloved leader. You also may have a predecessor who set up a culture that wasn't the best culture for the team to thrive. Either way, you have some things to do to overcome that. Again, yes, you're being seen through the lens of being a manager and leader at all times. And what you do and say now reflects on the organization more than ever. So in the next slide, we will talk about that legacy that you need to think about how you're going to overcome. Sometimes as well, it's overcoming the legacy of you as a team member and making that shift into you as a leader. So the first thing to know is that when you step into a new position, whether you're a seasoned leader stepping into a new position or somebody who's a manager or a leader for the first time, know that it's not about you. Some of the pushback that you're getting when you're sort of hearing stories about that's not the way the last person used to do things, that's about the change. It's not reflective on necessarily whether you're doing things right or wrong. It's people struggling with the change. It's people working their way through their emotions and coming to a new place with you. And one of the ways that you can fairly early on, particularly if you're moving into a new organization, you can start to work with that is you establish your credibility. And that's not about boasting, and that's not about emailing everybody your CV, but it is telling your story and talking to people about where you come from, the skills that you have, where you know that you're going to be looking to them as experts to support you in things. So starting that conversation about letting them know what you're all about and where you come from. And that includes your style and your expectations. Recognizing that people may not in the early days completely meet those expectations once you've articulated them. And part of it may be, the last leader talked a good talk, but then never held us accountable. So they're used to things a certain way. You're setting up new expectations, and they really want to know if those expectations are true or if there's something else that you expect from them that you're not articulating. And that's why when your expectations aren't met, the first thing you want to do is really seek to understand. Is this somebody who has challenging behaviors on an ongoing basis? Is this somebody that's really struggling to understand new expectations? Be very clear and consistent about what you expect. People will test boundaries, as Maria talked about her experience. When you have a new leader, a new manager, if there are decisions that have been made in the past that people don't like, they will come to you and sort of test, does that decision still stand? If you set expectations that aren't what people are used to, they will push and test, sometimes very subconsciously, not purposefully trying to make your life difficult, but they're really trying to find their way and how this new team with this new leader fits together. So you want to make sure you're walking the talk. You want to make sure that you are consistent. You welcome feedback from people. It's an opportunity to both hear what isn't working for people and also an opportunity to reinforce your expectations. So somebody might say, you asked us to do this, but I wasn't sure it's what you wanted us to do. And you can respond, no, when I ask you to do something, you can be sure that that is what I expect. There's no hidden agenda, whatever the case may be. And being human, of course, with all the messiness that entails. As you're sort of drinking from the fire hose in a new position, you're learning all of these new things. There will be moments where you aren't as consistent as you wanted to be. Take that moment, go back to the individual and say, that conversation didn't feel right to me. Can we try it again? Can we can we reframe this a little bit? Something that I always like to share is the idea of that it's okay as a manager and a leader to apologize, which 20 years ago was sort of not part of the management and leadership models that we were learning about. And certainly even just in the world in general, 20 years ago, a lawyer would tell you never to apologize, that once you apologize, that means that you're accepting liability. That means that you could be sued for something. Organizations were told, do not apologize. And in the mid to late 90s, Canada actually implemented legislation called the Apologies Act. And the purpose of that legislation was to say it is okay to apologize for things. Your apology cannot be held against you as far as bringing liability or attracting liability to you. They recognize that as human beings, we need to do that. And the example that I have that really brought that forward for me was when I was on the quality committee at St. Joseph's Healthcare in London. And we were talking about complaints that had been received and how many of those turned over into lawsuits. And it was noted that since the organization had been allowed by their lawyers to start to apologize for things, that fewer and fewer lawsuits were happening because they were able to make that human connection with people to say, yes, this was an error. Here's what we're going to do differently next time. And people felt satisfied with that and didn't sort of feel that frustration of needing to go to a lawsuit. So we'll move on to the next slide. And this slide talks about how you communicate as a leader. And in this visual, you will see our leader in her rain gear as we are all hiking through the rain. And she's giving us a thumbs up, even though that may not be exactly how she's feeling hiking through the rain. And I'm not saying don't be authentic and don't be true to yourself. But remembering that whatever it is that you're communicating, whatever it is that you're getting back when you're communicating, that it's not about you, it is about the broader organization, it is about the team and what you're accomplishing. And something that's really difficult for new leaders and managers is how do you communicate a decision that you don't agree with? Remembering you're representing the organization. Remembering that staff need to maintain confidence in you. confidence in the organization at large, and that at some point in the future you're going to need to enforce these decisions. And it can be very tricky if you have shared a decision and say, you know, I don't agree with this, but this is what we have to do. And then later on, somebody doesn't follow through and you have to turn around and try and enforce and say, no, that is exactly what we have to do. And the person looks at you and says, well, but you don't agree with it either. So remember all those things as you're deciding how you're going to communicate. And there's different ways of saying it. There's some examples here. You don't have to, again, sort of pretend, walk around with your thumbs up all the time. You can acknowledge that there's difficult decisions to be made, that there's two sides, pros and cons to decisions. And an example that I learned from a team of leaders is that they would support each other. When there was a decision that one of them was really struggling with, they'd sit down with the rest of the group and say, okay, help me talk through how I'm going to communicate this in a really positive way. And we'll talk a bit about support networks as well. So we'll move to the next slide. And this is about how you see others. So just as your previous team will see you differently when you move into a management and leadership position, you will also start to see them differently in some cases. And this is my tongue-in-cheek picture here. Is it's a lot of fun to go out kayaking with a dog until the dog is actually in your kayak and trying to jump out to go after a duck. So you may find colleagues that you previously didn't connect very well with. You didn't understand what they did. They were kind of removed and just had their head down doing their work. As a leader or a manager, you have a different view on them and you realize that they are really strong and really skilled at what it is that they are doing. And just because they're not the most fun person in the group, you just get that different, and vice versa. You may find that a colleague that you used to find a lot of fun, somebody who would sort of brighten up the day, has some challenges that you need to support them with as a leader or manager that's just very different than the perspective that you used to have of them. And the next slide talks a little bit more about some of those changes. We're going to dive a bit into giving feedback. It's something when you haven't been a leader or manager, you will have had some opportunity to do, I'm sure, and depending on your role, it may have been part of your role. Some roles, some frontline roles, the only time they give feedback is if their organization does a 360 performance review for other people, and that's your only exposure to it. So, and this feedback is just a key component of what you are doing as a leader and a manager. You must walk towards conflict. So again, as a frontline staff member, if you saw conflict happening somewhere else on the team, often the best approach was to stay away from it, to stay out of it, to let that conflict be resolved by others. As a leader or a manager, you are the other who needs to step towards that conflict and resolve it to support the team and empower the team. And you need to determine the best approach to support other people's success. So let's talk a little bit about feedback. And you'll be getting some resources that have even more tips on giving feedback. Our short version here is just a few things to remember about giving feedback. To be kind. And that means that sometimes if you're frustrated with somebody's behavior in the moment, you need to step away and take a bit of a deep breath before you navigate it. Addressing people's behavior instead of addressing an individual as sort of what they are. No, it's about what their behavior was. An example of this that I have is having a staff member move to my department from a different department who was expected to arrive at work on their first day at 8 a.m. and they showed up at 8:45. And I went through all of these, you know, first of all, are they okay? Did something happen to them? And then sort of that frustration, like on the first day, they're late, they haven't called me. Is this what I'm going to expect going forward? And sort of walking into that conversation with part of me wanting to just be very, very firm about, you know, that you were expected at 8 a.m., what happened? And the other part of me that said, okay, let's understand what happened. And when I asked the question, discovering that their previous supervisor had asked them to show up at their old position for the first half an hour just to help make sure that the person that was replacing them was well oriented, and it was actually their supervisor who didn't communicate with me. So they had, they thought that it had all been organized, and had I gone in with guns blazing, that would have set up the relationship from our very first interaction fairly negatively. So it's a good opportunity to understand the behavior, and then being clear. And being kind doesn't mean beating around the bush, because if you both walk out of the conversation with a different understanding of what the conversation was about, then you're going to have to address the behavior again, and they're not even going to know what they've done wrong. So being very clear about what it is that you're addressing. Make sure you're taking an opportunity to discuss the solutions, to be constructive. What can you do to help them as you're giving them this feedback? And then following up is critical. Address the issue if it comes up again, particularly if it is something that becomes a pattern. If you address it once and then you let it slide the next couple of times, you're kind of starting from scratch again the next time you address it. And that inconsistency makes people unclear on what your expectations are. You were okay when I did it last time, but you're not okay when I did it this time. And of course, taking those moments to provide positive feedback when you do see somebody really making a difference, to take your feedback on board and do something with it. So we're going to do another quick poll. Maria will move us to that software. And just want you to take a few minutes and reflect either on these 4 points or other things that you have experienced when you're giving feedback or thinking about giving feedback, and what is the most challenging part for you? So we can see as people are answering that, yes, sometimes in that moment of wanting to be very clear on policy, wanting to be very clear, and that sometimes being kind, you have to take that moment, you have to take that step back to ask some questions and really understand what's happening. Being clear, yeah, so everybody has sort of different challenges with what they need to work on as they think about how they give feedback, and just an opportunity to reflect. When you give feedback after the fact, take a few moments to reflect on what worked about it and what you could have done differently. For those of you in the Be Constructive, how can you be more constructive in supporting people with coming up with their own solutions, making suggestions yourself about what to do differently. So thank you very much for participating in the poll. And as we move on to the next slide, we introduced this idea of situational leadership in the COVID-19 webinar, and we promised that we would dive into a little bit deeper, and that's what we're going to do here today. So situational leadership is really about giving people what they need in the moment that they need it, recognizing that any individual can need directing at one point in time and delegating at another point in time. The situation and where the person is at related to that situation helps guide you as you pick what tools you're going to pull out of your toolkit to support that individual. So we'll start at the bottom right. And again, we talked about COVID-19 often being a place where you need to move into a directing mode. And directing is really about the person is eager to do the task. They have no idea, it's a brand new task to them. They have no idea what it is that you're asking them to do. They're motivated, but they just don't have that experience. So you're directing, you're being very, very clear about what the task is and the steps that you want them to take. You're building their competence in the task. So you're not doing a whole lot of coaching here. You're obviously providing positive reinforcement as things go well, positive feedback, but you're giving them a really safe place to try out something new by telling them exactly what it is that they are doing. Once they've developed some competence, you move into a bit more of a coaching. So you're still have that really strong safety net, about directing them what to do. But as you talk to them about what to do, you might provide more opportunities for them to think about it for themselves. So what step might you think about taking next? Or do you understand why I'm asking you to take this step next? It's a lot more dialogue happening in coaching, as you can see the places that they're frustrated, the places that are going really well, supporting them in that, in the way that they need it. And then again, they continue to develop competence in this particular task. The next time you ask them to do it, you're moving much more into supporting role. You're not telling them as much about what to do. You're developing their confidence. You're asking more of those questions. Okay, what step are you going to take next? Given the opportunity to describe it, do a little bit of talking about why that makes sense, that yes, that's the right thing to do. Absolutely, go ahead and take that step, or ask questions. Did you think about this aspect? Did you think about that aspect? So you're moving them into a much more comfortable place, but still having that safety net there. They can check in with you and you're checking in with them, which then takes you to the delegating. Somebody who's really competent in a particular task or activity, somebody who also has a really high confidence level because they've moved through this development stages in that activity. You're really setting the outcome, telling them what needs to be accomplished, and then sending them on their way. This is somebody that you know that when they need advice, they will come to you, that they won't get themselves into a situation where they're sort of over their heads, that they will approach and ask for what they need. And this model by Hersey and Blanchard has been around for quite a long time, and is actually the model that made me decide that this direction of working in organizations and leadership and management was really kind of a cool thing that I wanted to find out more about and move into. So we'll move to the next slide. And here's the next thing that's going to change for you. And it's a change in the influence that you have. And as a result of that influence, the approach that you're going to take to particular things. So what changes here, and I've mentioned this before, but it really is critical when you're a leader and a manager to recognize that you need to shift your perspective in some respects related to this, that your role is about empowering others. You are successful when others are empowered. And again, some of you, the frontline roles that you have, you're empowering clients, you're empowering patients. This is about empowering your team members and the people that you work with. Some of you, particularly folks who first get into leadership and management roles, end up having a dual role. They may be a part-time leader and part-time still working in their frontline position. And your leadership role needs to influence how you work in your frontline position. Even though you are not a full-time leader, you are a full-time leader in that when people look at you, they know you're a leader and how you carry yourself. They know you're a manager, and how you carry yourself will impact how they see you and will impact your ability to influence in the future. And of course, leading with empathy and connectedness that we've talked about a great deal in COVID, and recognizing that that's different from friendship. And clearly a lot of you have recognized that in our first poll in this portion of the webinar, when it came up loud and clear that that change in how you navigate and work with the people that you previously worked with as a colleague. And we'll move to the next slide. So we want to talk a little bit here about relational leadership, and knowing that the industries that you are in, the organizations that we work with at CfOE are very much relational organizations. And there's a definition there you can see of relational leadership, people accomplishing change in order to benefit the common good and the community, and that the process that you use in relational leadership is deeply focused on building and cultivating those relationships. And as we recognized again in the previous webinar today, that a formal leadership position is not required in order to practice these things. The other thing that I will mention is that relational leadership has really become more of a philosophy or a practice than a model. So the model I'm sharing with you today has 5 aspects to relational leadership. If you go to the literature, you'll see that there are some that talk about 7 aspects, some talk about 3 aspects. It really is about that process of cultivating relationships within your organization, with your partner organizations. And I'll start at the top, those relationships that are purposeful. So relationships that understand change, that you're doing things from a shared purpose, a shared values. Again, not necessarily about process of the individual things that you are doing together, but what are you trying to accomplish together. Inclusive, so a relational leader is aware of themselves, their strengths, the places that they need to work on, aware of others, and that others are coming from different places, different perspectives, have different stories that will be impacting how they develop those relationships with them. A relational leader values diversity. Diversity as well in skill set, diversity in what technical skills people bring to the table. And something that I've always said is if you're in a meeting and everybody in the meeting agrees on something vehemently, then you probably didn't need the meeting and you don't need everybody in the room. You bring people together to get different perspectives and diversity. A relational leader empowers. So again, understanding powers and understanding practices that you can use that will inhibit people being empowered for themselves or that will promote people will be empowered for themselves. And you'll be learning some of these things as we go through the rest of the webinar, some of those practices that you can use. And then it's process oriented. And as I mentioned under purposeful, this isn't process necessarily related to how I get from point A to point B to point C, which is part of your management and you do need to do. But when you're thinking about it from the perspective of a relational leadership, you're thinking about the process of relationships, the processes of groups, how groups work together, how you empower groups to be more successful working together, the dynamics of a group and a community and how they come together. And a relational leader is ethical. So relational leadership is built around organizations like the organizations that you are all in who have a commitment to social responsibility. And relational leader has integrity, authenticity, and develops trust. And moving on to our next slide. The other thing that changes, and this has been a little bit of a theme, and again, is something that many of you brought up, is relationship with team members, the people who have, your colleagues who have been your network of support, likely, before you were in a formal management position, how you need to navigate those things a little bit differently, how you need to develop networks of support that will work with you. So we go back to my bungee jump because that was quite an accomplishment for me. And the image here really is about taking that leap and the networks of support that I had there. So, you know, on the bridge with the harness that 3 or 4 people checked before I got to the edge of the bridge. You can see the gentleman there who was talking me to the edge and talking me through taking that step off of it. And everybody needs that. Everybody needs networks of support professionally to help navigate those challenging times, to bounce ideas off of. So we will move to the next slide. So you do need to realign expectations of previous colleagues, and that's a gentle, but again, very firm and being very consistent about that. One of the things that's key, again, that we talked about a little bit earlier, is you can no longer be, as a manager leader, you can no longer be a passive recipient of complaints. So you can think about, you know, sitting in the lunchroom and talking about a process that isn't working for you and just kind of with your colleagues expressing frustration and that kind of thing. You can't really sit in that conversation anymore and to just sit in that conversation. When you hear complaints, you have to think about what it is that you're going to be doing with those complaints. How are you going to reflect on them? And that might make it difficult to sit in those conversations in the same way that you used to. So talking to people about what what needs to be different about that. And again, seeking out your new opportunities to develop supportive relationships. So the next slide that we'll go to just has a few more examples of some of the expectations that you need to realign for yourself and for your colleagues about and how you navigate some of these things. So friendships in the workplace, friendships that you had with colleagues, thinking about people who now report to you. You really need to think about some of the implications of how you navigate your relationships with people. Somebody who reports to you when you are their manager and leader, you want to be connected, you want to be empathetic, you want to make gestures that are akin to friendship gestures. However, there are some fundamental differences between a friendship that is solely a friendship and this connected, empathetic, leaderful relationship that you have with people. One of those things is that there is a change in balance of power. So again, we talked about how people look at you and how you look at them. You know, in a friendship that is solely a friendship, it's really a level playing field, and there are elements here that it's definitely not a level playing field as far as the balance of power. You need to think about how other people will look upon those friendships. So if you have somebody in your team that you are connecting with more, how does that play out for the whole team dynamic? How do other people sort of feel about that, and do they feel left out? Confidentiality, again, when you have somebody that you're a friend with, you share any number of things, and there are certain things that you cannot share with people, even though you want to work with empathy and connectedness. And of course, your legal responsibility to the organization. You never want to end up in a position where you have developed a friendship with somebody that is in conflict with what you need to do as a leader and a manager, put either of you in that position. So the connectedness, the empathy that you have as a leader and a manager is very different than what you have in a friendship. Again, something else that you need to talk to people about is complaints. And something that I think a lot of leaders at some point run into in their career is somebody coming to them with a complaint and opening the conversation with, I want to tell you about an issue, but I need it to be confidential. And again, many of you have dealt with confidentiality in many, many ways in your roles already, but it's really important to recognize that you cannot commit to confidentiality with a staff member who's bringing something to you until after you've heard the thing. So there are things that they will bring to you that they want to be held in confidence for any number of reasons, and you cannot commit to that confidentiality. They have a responsibility. If there's an issue in the organization that needs to be addressed, they have a responsibility to bring it forward. You have a responsibility to hear that issue and then make a decision how you're going to navigate it. Hopefully, many of your organizations have some policies around when people make complaints and confidentiality. You can assure people that you will, to the best of your ability, keep things confidential depending on the issue. Sometimes you can ask about why they want confidentiality, and I've often heard the concern is about reprisals. And again, hopefully your organization has a policy about that. You can reassure people that your organization does not stand for reprisals. And if that becomes an issue, then that's something that will need to be dealt with. When you hear complaints as well, that doesn't always mean that you have to jump in and resolve it. Sometimes somebody's coming to you because they want to have a conversation with somebody about an issue and they don't know how to do it. So you can support them to do their own problem solving to resolve the issue, but you need to start to learn how to recognize when something needs to be escalated and when something can be left to the person to resolve. That's a risk management issue that you may have information that the person doesn't have. So a person may be complaining about somebody who has a particular behavior, and they don't want you to do anything about it because it was the first time that it happened and it made them, you know, uneasy about a policy being broken, but they don't think it's happened very often. But you might actually know that it's happened more than once. You may have had other people come to you. So again, you've got some confidentiality things there, and you need to be able to make the decision to escalate. People will ask you for information that you can't share. and it's often comes from a good place. Somebody is suddenly off for 2 weeks and people want to know if they're okay. And as a leader or manager, the person may have told you what's happening, but of course, unless they give you permission, you can't explain that to anybody. So you have information you can't share with people. When you were their colleague, if they told you, it was different. Now that you're the manager, when they tell you, unless you make it clear that they're okay with you sharing, it's not yours to share. So you can say to people, you know, I can't answer that question. It puts me in a difficult position when you ask, because it's not mine to share. And be very aware of people playing what I call the guessing game. So all of us can think about sort of a news conference where you just hear somebody saying over and over again, I can't confirm or deny. And it can be easy to get trapped into denying things that aren't true when people are guessing. And then it comes to the point where they say something that is true and you can't say anything without lying. And if you've been denying everything else, you've essentially confirmed the thing. So just be very careful thinking about being, again, very consistent about how you respond to that. You do need a confidant, you do need support, networks of support. The other thing to think about if your previous colleagues, if there's somebody who used to be your confidant who's on the team and you're sharing things with them now, they do have that leader manager hat on you when you're talking to them, and they may start to wonder what you're sharing with other people. So, and setting up a team member to be your confidant can damage the relationship if you need to have a challenging conversation with them later. And an example of that, I know a leader that I worked with had done exactly that. A team member who was in a helping profession, who was very seasoned and very senior, and she started using him as a bit of a sounding board for things. And then a policy came up that he wasn't following, that she had to address with him. And he was quite offended, and more offended than perhaps he would have been if they hadn't already had that relationship. And it was very uncomfortable for both of them. It was more uncomfortable for her than she thought it should have been. And she had to spend some time both repairing and reframing that. So take some time to cultivate productive relationships with your new management colleagues. Look outside of your organization as well as within your organization. Find those networks of people who are experiencing the same things that you are experiencing, that have a similar perspective as far as some of the challenges of leadership and management. And of course, most importantly, the person that you report to. That's your place that you're going to hopefully have the strongest supportive relationship. People will challenge your decision, and as I talked about earlier, that idea of boundary testing, shifting, that sometimes when you're talking about technical things, you can defend your position because it's about data and it's about evidence. And when you're talking about decisions that have pros and cons, you don't want to be shifted into a place of defending your decision. You want to explain why the decision was made. So there's a bit of a nuance there, and it takes some practice. And don't commit to changing the decision. You can commit to listening. You can commit to getting more information. Don't commit to changing the decision until you're absolutely sure that that's the right thing to do. And it's rarely the right thing to do just because one person has challenged you. And again, people will test boundaries for any number of reasons, and even subconsciously they may be testing boundaries. Be as consistent as you can, and when you slip up, acknowledge it. Don't be afraid to revisit a conversation and say, you know, I'm not sure we ended up in the right place there. Can we just have a quick chat about it again? So we'll move to our next slide. Where I really want to wrap up because this may have felt very heavy about all of the different things that you have to think about that are going to be different for you. And remember, if you spent some time and you've done the work that Maria has spoken to you about in the first hour of the webinar, your why stays the same. And that's why it's so valuable to have it. You can ground in that. My image here that really reflects that for me is I had not spent more than a half a dozen times on a bicycle since I was a teenager until I went out to Whistler. And I went out to Whistler to get into nature, to enjoy the scenery, to develop new networks of people who were interested in different things. And some of the things that we were hiking, we were kayaking, very comfortable with that. Not so comfortable on a bike, but we spent some time on a bike, and I discovered actually a real joy of biking. And that is something that I've added to my repertoire of things that I do now. And again, as you move into something like leadership and management, you know, my why, the reason I get on a bike is the same reason that I get into a kayak, but it's a new means of getting there. It's a new means of getting to my why, and hopefully leadership and management will do that for you. So as we spend just a couple minutes wrapping up, there will be 3 reflection questions for those of you who are doing the certificate. It's the same strategy as Maria articulated previously, in that maximum 3 pages double spaced for the total. So a page of questions. Some of these pages might only take some of these questions might only take half a page, but please maximize at 3 pages in total. And for those of you who aren't taking the certificate, hopefully it's an opportunity to just spend some quiet time when you can to reflect on these on your own. So your legacy as a leader in your organization, we talked about that you will have to navigate other people's legacies. What do you want your legacy to be when you leave an organization, when you leave a team? Similar to the reflection that Maria talked about, thinking about your 80th birthday. This is a little bit more focused on the organization. What do you need to do to strengthen your networks of support and ensure that you have appropriate networks of support when you move into that management leadership position? What are some of the strategies that you can use? And going back to how critical feedback is as a manager and leader, and that some of you, most of you sort of responded to our poll and recognize that there are areas that are more challenging for you than others. So spend a little bit of time thinking about how you can actively develop some of those skills. What are the things that you're going to do to put it into practice? And so we will close our webinar, moving back into a poll. Before we do that, just to make sure that you know that, again, you'll get an email following the webinar. We'll be asking you for some feedback, and we hope that you will provide it to us. Those reflective practice questions, you'll be getting, those of you who are doing the certificate, you'll get a link to complete those reflective practice questions, and we ask you to complete them before the next webinar. And then everybody, regardless of whether or not you're doing a certificate, will get a link and a password to the recorded webinar and all of the resources that we've talked about. So we'll move to the poll, and we'll use the same poll that we did in the COVID-19 as everybody checks out and moves on with the rest of their afternoon. Really, how are you feeling as you're leaving our 2-hour session today? Thank you for dedicating the time to spend with us. We very much appreciate it and hope that this has been a valuable opportunity. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which is about communication skills as a leader and manager. Thank you.